Welcome back, everyone. This video is going to continue our series on the philosophy of mind by talking about some challenges and objections to the Turing test. We're going to start the video by getting a better understanding of the purpose of Turing's test. This will include making clear the difference between necessary and sufficient conditions, and then also considering two different ways to challenge Turing on computer intelligence. Then we'll go on to discuss different arguments against Turing's ideas. The first are arguments from disabilities, the second are arguments from consciousness, the third are arguments from programming. All these are meant to be arguments against Turing's claim that it's possible to build a computer with intelligence. Turing's proposal for investigating the possibility of computer intelligence is that he thinks we ought to test whether or not we can build a computer that is able to give replies that are indistinguishable from those of a human being. So much so that the computer would have the ability to fool a human interrogator into thinking that it was in fact a human rather than a computer. This is a precursor to the functionalist view of the mind, as we discussed in an earlier video. The question and answer method is a way to test a computer's ability to perform the same functions as the human mind. The hardware of the computer runs a program, a table of instruction or a book of rules that enables the computer, using its executive unit and control, to take those inputs, those questions, process them and manipulate them and turn them into the relevant outputs or replies. Now, Turing doesn't care that the computer uses silicon chips to perform these functions of manipulating inputs into outputs, while human beings use our brains to manipulate questions and turn them into appropriate responses. According to Turing, as long as those things are performing the same function, if we attribute intelligence to the one process, we ought to attribute intelligence to the other as well. Now, Turing's position on the possibility of computer intelligence is really informed by two beliefs that he has. First, he's optimistic that with increased storage, speed, and better programming, we'd eventually be able to build a computer that could pass the Turing test. Now, Turing admits he doesn't have concrete evidence of this during the 1950s. And even now, by most measures, we haven't built a computer that can pass the Turing test. But Turing's claim is not that the computers during his time, or even right now, are capable of passing the Turing test. His claim is that eventually we would be able to do this at some point in the future with increased technology. Now, the past success that the AI field has had since Turing's time may provide us with some evidence that this is at least theoretically possible to do as our technology improves throughout the future. Now, Turing's other central belief is that his test is a good test of intelligence. Notice this is essential to his reasoning, because even if it's possible to pass the Turing test, if that test is not a good test of intelligence, then that would tell us nothing about whether computer intelligence is possible. In other words, Turing thinks his test is a good method for detecting intelligence in a computer. And you can look at our previous discussion in the past videos of the advantages of his test to motivate this kind of belief. Now, it's important, though, to distinguish two ways you might use the Turing test as a means for detecting intelligence or thinking in a computer. Firstly, you might wonder whether passing the Turing test is sufficient for having intelligence, thought, a mind, or understanding. Alternatively, you might wonder whether passing the Turing test is necessary for having intelligence, thought, a mind, and understanding. This second claim seems to be clearly mistaken. Passing Turing's test certainly isn't necessary to have intelligence or to have thinking. If I were to place a young child 6 years old in one room and an average adult person in the other, if I were to ask them questions and look at their replies, I guarantee you I could distinguish between the replies that came from the 6-year-old and those that came from the average adult. The fact that the 6-year-old fails to trick me into believing they're the adult doesn't mean that they don't have intelligence. It perhaps just means that their thinking, their intelligence, is different than that of an adult. Similarly, if a computer fails the Turing test, we shouldn't think that that means that it doesn't have intelligence. Maybe its intelligence or thought is just different than that of a human being. However, Turing is relying on the idea that passing the Turing test is sufficient for having intelligence, thought, mind, or understanding. His claim is that if it is able to give just as good of answers as the human being, then we ought to attribute intelligence to it. That's enough, even if it's not necessary. So, putting this together, Turing claims that passing the Turing test is sufficient for showing that it has genuine literal thought processes and intelligence. Then he claims that a computer could theoretically, with increased technology, pass this test. And so he concludes that it's theoretically possible to build a computer that has a literal mind and thought. Looking at this argument, it's deductively valid. Its modus ponens, if A, then B, A, therefore B. The conclusion follows from the premises. And so if you want to challenge this conclusion, if you think that no, computers can't really have genuine literal thoughts, they can't have a mind in the same sense that the human being can, you're going to have to reject one of these premises. And that means there's two ways to go about this. You could try to challenge Turing and resist the conclusion by arguing that computers will never be able to pass this test. Alternatively, you could challenge Turing and resist the conclusion by trying to argue that his test is a bad test for intelligence, by arguing that passing this test is not enough to prove intelligence or thought. So the first kind of challenge that Turing looks at is what we can call the argument from disabilities. These are arguments that there are intellectual things that humans can do that computers will never be able to do. So not just they aren't able to do it yet, but that they will never be able to do it. Moreover, notice my emphasis on intellectual things. We'll never be able to build a computer that is able to engage in the process of biological reproduction because computers are not biological things. Human beings can engage in biological reproduction, but this is a physical ability we have. It's irrelevant to whether something has intelligence or thought. And so that's not the right kind of thing to use to give this kind of argument. Now, if you succeed at finding an intellectual ability that humans have that computers will never have, then we could theoretically distinguish computer and human answers by asking questions about the task that the computer cannot perform. And so this challenges the claim that a computer would eventually be able to pass Turing's test, even with improved technology. It doesn't, however, challenge the adequacy of the test itself. So maybe the test is a good test of intelligence, but the claim is that the computer's never going to be able to pass it because of the inherent limitations of the means by which computers produce their answers. In order to make good on this objection, though, you need to provide support for this claim that there's intellectual things computers will never be able to do, as well as humans. But here's some supposed examples that people have tried to give. Some people claim that computers will never be capable of kindness or generosity, of expressing love, making mistakes, or expressing creativity. These are all things that the human mind is capable of doing. They're not just physical abilities, they are intellectual abilities. And so if computers cannot do these things, then it looks like there's certain intellectual capacities that computers will never have. So how does Turing respond to this kind of objection? Well, firstly, many of the tasks that people say computers will never be able to do are actually pretty easy to imagine programming a computer to do. Some people say computers will never be able to make mistakes because they have to follow their programming. Well, first of all, obviously there are mechanical errors, but here's another thing. If I'm programming a calculator, I don't want to program it to give me incorrect answers, since I want the calculator to give me the correct answers to help me out when I don't know the answer. But if I'm trying to program a computer to pass a Turing test, it's actually pretty easy to program a computer to give a wrong answer. I could easily program the computer such that when I ask it to add 2 and 7, it tells me that the answer is 123. Now, I'm probably not going to do it because it wouldn't be a very useful thing to program into a computer, but I could very easily do so. Well, what about expressing love? Well, how do human beings express their love in words? Well, they say things like, I love you. Or I can ask them questions about it. I can say, have you ever been in love? I can ask you, what did it feel like? How would you define love? Human beings oftentimes aren't very good at actually describing their emotions or explaining what they mean. If I were to ask you, what is love? How does it feel? You might say things like, well, when you're in love, it sort of feels like butterflies in your stomach. Or you might say, love is when you care about another person so much that you're willing to sacrifice your own well-being in order to benefit them. But notice, if that's how we express love in words, or express our understanding of love in words, I can easily program a computer to give those same answers, to utter those same words when asked about love. Now, we should also keep in mind there's a long history of people saying things like, computers will never be able to do this. And then computer scientists are like, hold on, I'll be right back. They go do some work, they come back and say, here's a computer that can do that thing that you told me they'd never be able to do. And so whenever someone makes this kind of argument or claim, we should hesitate a bit and be a bit skeptical before jumping to the conclusion this is impossible. As a couple examples, we've already created computers that can write screenplays. They're not the best, but they have a plot, they have characters, they have character development, etc. People have taken the screenplays, turned them into movies, and submitted them to competitions. We've made computers that can write music. Just ask Siri to beatbox. Not very impressive, but we've built computers that do it better than Siri. We can program computers to give wrong answers to math questions. We can program computers that can beat even the best human beings at strategy games like chess and Go. We've programmed computers that can beat Jeopardy champions at answering trivia questions that involve general knowledge about multiple different topics. We've created computers that can modify its own programs. We've created computers that can observe the consequences of its own behaviors and then adapt its future strategies to hopefully get better outcomes than it got with its first choices. Another kind of objection to Turing on computer intelligence is what you can call the argument from consciousness. These kind of arguments claim that computers lack true intelligence because they lack consciousness. The idea is that computers might be programmed to give the appropriate responses. So maybe they are programmed so that when I ask them about love, they give us the same kinds of answers that human beings would give when I ask them about love. But the claim is that they might be able to give those responses without any genuine understanding of the responses that they're giving. You could develop this by saying, look, you can create a computer that can write a poem. However, the objection claims that the computer only counts as understanding the ideas of that poem if it wrote those words because of thoughts and emotions that it was conscious of and actually felt itself. And so the claim here is, if I ask a computer about love and it tells me it feels like butterflies in your stomach and it tells me that it's caring about someone so much that you would sacrifice your own well-being for them, if the computer hasn't actually felt those emotions, the idea is they're just uttering these words with no understanding of what they really mean. If there are no conscious feelings or thoughts behind those words, behind those replies, then those replies are given without any true understanding of what they mean, no real thinking or intelligence behind them. Consider an analogy. You all probably have the experience of sometimes you drive on autopilot when you take a route that you've been on numerous times. Maybe it's your route from work to home that you've done thousands of times. Well, it becomes so automatic that sometimes maybe you zone out, you drive home, and when you get done, when you get home, you don't even really remember making the turns that you did. You weren't really paying attention. You were on autopilot. The claim here is that you were just driving automatically. You were processing that information and making the relevant turns without any real thought or intelligence going on because you weren't conscious of making those choices when you did. And so someone might say, this is what happens in a computer. It's just automatically processing that information without being conscious or aware of it. It's just doing it on autopilot, and so it doesn't have any genuine understanding or intelligence. Now, this kind of challenge is not denying the possibility of programming a computer that passes Turing test. Instead, it's challenging the claim that passing the test is sufficient for having the mind. They're questioning the quality of Turing's test itself. It's saying even if a computer passes, we shouldn't conclude that the computer has any genuine intelligence or understanding because they might not have any consciousness to go with those replies. How does Turing try to respond to this? Turing points out that the objection apparently assumes that the only way to know that something has consciousness is to be that thing and experience the thoughts and feelings yourself. So even if the computer gives those replies, we don't know that it actually consciously feels anything or has any intelligence because we can't experience its thoughts. But this assumption is problematic because it implies that I can't know that anyone other than myself has a mind. Yes, it tells me that I can't know that the computer has a mind when it gives me those responses, but it also implies that I can't know that you have a mind or intelligence when you give me replies to my questions, since I can't experience your thoughts or your emotions or your feelings. And so I don't know if your words are just given to me automatically without any true understanding of what you're saying. The only evidence you have that other human beings besides yourself have conscious thoughts is what they say and do. And in the case of human beings, we think that their verbal behavior and responses give us good evidence that they really are conscious, that they understand our questions, that they have a mind, thought, and intelligence. And so if a computer passes the Turing test, it displays verbal behavior that's indistinguishable from that of a human being, it seems we have just as much evidence that it's conscious as we have for believing that other human beings are conscious. Now note, an alternative response could claim that maybe consciousness isn't necessary for intelligence, thought, or understanding. Reconsider that driving on autopilot example. Someone might say, I don't remember the turns that I made when I was on autopilot because I wasn't conscious or aware of what was going on, but maybe I had unconscious thinking going on, and that explains why I was able to navigate the roads even though I wasn't conscious of it. Of course, this would imply that there's an aspect of the mind besides intelligence or thinking. More on that later. Lastly, some people argue against Turing by appealing to what we can call arguments from programming. So this is what Turing calls Lady Lovelace's objection and also the question of learning machines. So Lady Lovelace is Ada Lovelace, actually the person we named my youngest daughter after. How do these arguments go? The first version of this objection says, since computers are merely acting on the programming created by a human being, and we have that executive unit and control such that they have to follow their program, that's all they can do, a computer's responses or ideas can never be original or authentic. The idea is those responses are not really coming from the computer, they're coming from the person who programmed the computer. Moreover, those answers, those replies can't be surprising since we put the programming there and we could thereby predict exactly what they're going to do if we know what that programming is. Another version of this says, when I respond to questions, when you ask me my name, you ask me how I'm doing, I don't consult a rule book. I don't sort of look, what should I do when someone asks me what my name is? Tell them it's Sam. I don't look at a rule book and then follow those rules to give my answers. Thus, there seems to be a disanalogy between the process that humans use and the process that computers use to give their responses, so that even if humans have thought or intelligence behind their answers, we shouldn't thereby think that computers also have thought or intelligence, since they're getting to those answers in a different way. The last version of this objection says the computer must follow its programming. It has that control that makes sure it follows those rules and in the right order. The computer is thereby stuck with that programming and is never going to learn or make progress or change. But humans, part of what makes us intelligent is our capacity to learn and change our responses on the basis of our past experience. We can go through a process where we use new information that we encounter or utilize new abilities that we've developed in order to modify our future responses. So for instance, maybe you study for a quiz and those methods that you use, you don't do particularly well on the quiz. And then you might decide, okay, I'm not going to use those same methods. I'm going to change the methods that I use. And so you try a new method and you do better on the next quiz. Then you might update and say, okay, now I'm going to do that instead of my first way of studying. So how might someone reply to these kind of arguments? Well, firstly, we can program random elements into a computer program that would make it impossible to predict a computer's responses to certain questions. So a computer could be programmed to act in ways that no person could predict in advance, even if they know exactly how the computer is programmed. And in that way, a computer could surprise us. We can also program computers that create programs. We can even design what are called learning machines that have a feedback mechanism that observes the results of their behavior and then uses that information to update its responses in the future. Google made a program called AlphaGo. That's an interesting example. So there's a game called Go. It's like chess, but fewer rules, but more complicated strategy. Probably about 6 years ago, computer scientists were predicting that using their current methods of creating AI, they weren't going to be able to produce a computer that would be able to beat a champion Go player at this game for another 25 years. But then Google tried a new approach. Essentially, they programmed the rules of the game into the AI, but they didn't program any strategies for that AI to use. Instead, they programmed it so it would play about 100 games with actual live persons. It would make random moves and assess, did it win, did it lose? And then it would try new moves the next time. And then did it win, did it lose? And it would then use that information to update the strategies that it would use next time. After it played games with 100 players, it then was programmed to play millions of games with itself, doing the same process to figure out which placements, which strategies tended to lead to winning and tended not to lead to winning. By doing this, in a matter of years instead of decades, Google was able to create a computer program that was capable of beating the best Go player in the world. And when it did so, the AI actually used strategies in that game that no human being, neither the programmers nor the professional Go players, had ever thought of before. It performed moves that people saw and were like, that's a terrible move. Why would you do that? It doesn't make any sense. And it ended up working and winning. It surprised even the best human players of this game. Lastly, this challenge to Turing assumes that human behavior isn't programmed and determined by physical rules. Human behavior may seem new and unpredictable without rules, simply because we're unaware of those program or rules that our mind is following. Perhaps we are following rules unconsciously without us being aware. We might not consciously follow a book of rules when we create our responses. However, psychology seems to work under the assumption that our minds do follow rules that we're often not conscious of as a way to explain why we behave the way we do. So that's all for this video. See you all next time. Bye-bye.